Have you ever crossed a border without even noticing it? In Australia, you can do that just by walking across a random rock in the middle of the ocean, or by standing in a paddock where nobody actually agrees where one state ends and the other begins. On the map, Australia looks simple: big island, clean lines, lots of straight-edge borders in the outback. But when you zoom in, the neat lines start to fall apart. Old survey mistakes, rivers that moved, political deals made more than a century ago. Together, they create some of the strangest borders on the planet, hiding in plain sight. In this video, we're going to look at 7 Australian borders so weird they basically break the map. Some of them turn a useless rock into a land border between states. Others cut through farms, towns, and even rivers in ways that make zero sense if you actually live there. And one of them quietly connects Australia to European countries thousands of kilometers away without most Australians ever realizing it. Here's how this is going to work. As we go through the list, from number 7 down to number 1, pick your favorite broken border and drop it in the comments. Which one would you show to a friend who thinks geography is boring and maps are always accurate? By the end, you'll have at least one example that completely destroys that idea. Alright, before we jump into the list, let's talk about why Australia ended up with so many strange borders in the first place. When the lines between the states were drawn in the 1800s, surveyors were working with basic tools, limited knowledge of the interior, and pretty terrible maps. In London and in the colonial capitals, politicians loved straight lines from this meridian to that parallel, from this river to that coast. It looked clean on paper. But the Earth doesn't care about straight lines. Rivers twist, islands turn out to be in slightly different places than expected. And the curve of the planet means a line that is straight on an old map might not be so straight in reality. Add to that the fact that some borders were drawn before anyone had actually visited the area. And you end up with a lot of good enough decisions that later became legal facts carved into constitutions. Fast forward more than 100 years, and those sleepy decisions now control who pays tax where, which police force responds to a call, and which state claims ownership of tiny islands, riverbanks, and even the dirt under your feet. Most of the time, nobody cares. But sometimes those old lines collide with the real world in hilarious ways. That's where our list starts. Number 7. Boundary Islet, the rock that accidentally gave Tasmania a land border. In the middle of Bass Strait, between mainland Australia and Tasmania, there's a small, miserable piece of rock called Boundary Islet. It's not exactly anyone's dream holiday destination. No beach, no palm trees, just waves, wind, and seabirds. But on the official map, something very strange happens right across this rock. The state border between Victoria and Tasmania runs straight through the middle of Boundary Islet. That means, technically, Tasmania and Victoria share a land border here. It's the only place where Tasmania touches another state on land, and it happens on a rock that almost no one will ever stand on. The funny part is that this probably wasn't the original plan. When the border was defined, the idea was to draw a neat line along a specific latitude, minus 39 degrees 12 minutes south, that was meant to separate the jurisdiction of the two colonies nice and cleanly across Bass Strait. But early surveyors mismeasured the position of the island, or at least didn't worry about the tiny offset. The line was locked into legal text, and when more accurate maps came along, it turned out that the line sliced Boundary Islet in half. Now, in practical terms, nothing dramatic happens here. There's no border checkpoint, no customs office, no tiny half Victoria, half Tasmania lighthouse keeper. But on paper, this rock has created endless confusion in trivia nights, pub arguments, and random internet forums about whether Tasmania has a land border or not. Legally, yes. Meaningfully, not really. Imagine being the person who first realized this. You re-staring at modern coordinates and old legal descriptions, and suddenly you see that the only land border between Tasmania and the rest of Australia is a lump of rock that someone in the 19th century probably never even set foot on. Somewhere, there is a lawyer who had to write a very serious memo about this and keep a straight face. If you're watching from Tasmania or Victoria, I'm genuinely curious. Who do you think should own Boundary Islet? If someone offered to redraw the border today and give the whole rock to one state, which one deserves it, and why is the correct answer obviously your state? Let me know in the comments. I want to see which side is more competitive about a rock almost nobody will ever visit. Alright, from one tiny mistake in Bass Strait. Let us move inland to a place where 3 states try to meet at a single point, and even that turned out to be harder than it sounds. Number 6. McCabe Corner, the triangle that almost got it wrong. If you look at a political map of Australia, you'll see a neat little point where New South Wales, South Australia, and Victoria are all supposed to meet. On the ground, that point is called McCabe Corner, and it is literally marked by a metal post and a small triangle of cleared land. But the story of how that point ended up where it is involves disagreements over rivers, dodgy measurements, and a long argument about whether South Australia had been cheated out of land. Originally, the plan was simple. The border between South Australia and Victoria would follow the 141st meridian east, a nice clean north-south line. The problem was that early surveyors in the 1840s and 1850s didn't have GPS, satellites, or even really accurate chronometers. They worked with stars, long chains, and a lot of guesswork, and they ended up placing the line a bit too far west of the true meridian. Later, when better equipment arrived, everyone realized the border was technically in the wrong place. But by then, farms had been settled and maps had been printed. South Australia argued that it had lost a strip of land that should have been theirs, something like 3 to 4 kilometers wide, running the whole length of the border. They wanted the line moved east to the correct 141st meridian, or compensated for the mistake. Victoria politely said, "Yeah, nah," and pointed out that moving the border would throw every property boundary into chaos. After a lot of legal back and forth, the High Court essentially ruled that the existing wrong but practical line would stand. That's how we got McCabe Corner, the place where a historically incorrect borderline meets another historically incorrect borderline, and everyone has just agreed to live with it. If you ever visit it, it's not grand or dramatic, just a scrubby patch of dirt with a survey marker and maybe a few flies to welcome you. But when you stand there, you literally standing on a compromise between mathematical precision and the reality that humans are too messy to redraw whole states once people have moved in. Before we head to the next border, quick question for you. Would you fix mistakes like this, if you could, even if it meant shifting entire towns into a new state? Or do you think close enough is good enough when it comes to lines on a map? Tell me what you'd do if you were in charge. Redraw the map, or leave history as errors alone. Let's move from 3 states, meeting at a point to 2 states, wrestling over a river. Number 5. The Murray River border, where the line follows the water, except when it doesn't. The Murray is one of Australia's most important rivers, running along much of the boundary between New South Wales and Victoria. On paper, the border is simple. In many sections, it's defined as the top of the bank on the Victorian side. In other words, the whole river is technically in New South Wales, and Victoria starts only once you step onto dry land. But rivers, like we said earlier, don't stay still. Over the decades, the Murray has shifted its course in many places, eroding one bank, depositing sand on another, cutting new channels during floods. That means there are spots where the legal border is tied to an old bank line that doesn't quite match where the main flow of the river is today. In a few locations, you can stand on what feels like the Victorian side of the Murray and technically still be in New South Wales, or vice versa. It's the kind of thing that makes sense to lawyers and nobody else. For boaters and anglers, this can get confusing fast. Fishing regulations, boating laws, and even emergency services can differ between the 2 states. So you might literally cross a legal boundary just by drifting a few meters downriver, same water, same fish, different rules. If you've ever been on the Murray and had to Google which side am I legally on right now, you've felt exactly how weird this border is. Imagine a barbecue on the riverbank where one group is technically drinking under New South Wales law and another group, a few steps higher up the bank, is under Victorian law. Nothing looks different in reality. But on the books, those invisible lines still matter for taxes, policing, and land management. It's like someone took a highlighter to a random contour line and said, "Yep, that's a state border now, forever." If you've done a road trip or camping trip along the Murray, I'd love to know which side you prefer, New South Wales or Victoria, and whether you ever even thought about which state you were technically in. Drop your answer below, because your stories along the river might be more interesting than anything a map can show. Let us stay on the theme of borders, that Dan T line, up with how people actually live. Number 4. The stranded shire tiny exclaves created by council lines. Inside the state of Victoria, there are places where local government boundaries carve out little pockets of land that don't connect to the rest of their own council area. One example is a small section of shire land cut off by a mountain resort area, so to go from the main part of the shire to this little patch by road, you technically have to leave and re-enter your own municipality. For residents, that means their rates go to one council, but they might be physically closer to another council's offices, services, and events. It's like living in a tiny island of bureaucracy, surrounded by a different set of rules and road signs in day-to-day life. Most people don't notice or care who picks up their rubbish or maintains the local roads, as long as someone does it, but these little exclaves become a headache when it comes to planning. Emergency response and local politics, especially when voters feel ignored because they an out-of-the-way tail on a map. For map fans, though, they great fun. You can drive a few minutes and cross the same council boundary 3 times without ever leaving one state. This is also where Australia's love of neat, straight lines runs into the messy reality of mountains, rivers, and where people actually live. Someone in an office in the capital decided decades ago that a boundary should follow a simple grid. But then a ski resort or a new town popped up right on that line. Instead of redrawing everything, they just carved out tiny shapes to make it legally work, and those shapes are still there today. Quick mid-video check-in. If you're still here, you clearly enjoy this kind of weird, zoomed-in geography. If you want more laid-back deep dives like this from inside, Australia borders ghost towns, strange islands, tapping. The like button is the easiest way to tell the algorithm and also to tell me to make more episodes in this style. No pressure, but it does help a lot more than it looks from your side of the screen. Coming up next, we're going to push the idea of Australian borders even further to invisible lines over the ocean that technically put Australia next door to European countries you would never expect. This is where the map stops feeling like a map and starts feeling like a trick question. Number 3. Australia's hidden European neighbours, the borders you never see on a globe. When people think about Australia's neighbours, they usually picture Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and a whole string of Pacific islands. But thanks to a web of overseas territories and maritime zones, Australia actually rubs shoulders with a couple of European countries as well, just not in places you'd expect. Take France, for example. Most people think of the Eiffel Tower and croissants, not the Indian Ocean. But France also controls territories like the Kerguelen Islands and the tiny St. Paul and Amsterdam Islands, way out in the southern Indian Ocean. Draw the exclusive economic zones around those islands and around Australia's territories like Heard Island and the McDonald Islands, and suddenly you find invisible maritime borders where Australia meets France in cold, empty stretches of ocean. On a classroom wall map, you'd never see that line. There's no border crossing, no fence, not even a buoy. Just water, fish, and maybe the occasional research ship quietly crossing from one country's jurisdiction into another. But on legal charts, the boundary is very real. It determines who can fish where, who can search for oil or gas, and whose environmental laws apply to the seabed. There are similar stories with other countries that still hold distant territories in the region. It's a weird reminder that colonial history hasn't fully gone away. It's just hiding out in the fine print of maritime law. For a country like Australia, which likes to think of itself as a big, mostly self-contained island, it's strange to realize there are bits of Europe parked just beyond its ocean doorstep. If you're the kind of person who enjoys map trivia, this is your time to shine. If someone ever asks which European countries share a border with Australia, you now have a trick question lined up. Throw your best guess in the comments. And if you're watching this years from now and the political map has changed again, let me know what I got wrong. Number 2, the ruler's straight borders that aren't quite straight. One of the things that makes Australia's map so striking is all the long, straight lines in the center of the continent. The borders between Western Australia, South Australia, and the Northern Territory look as if someone just grabbed a ruler and drew them on. In a sense, that's exactly what happened. Politicians in London and the colonial capitals loved the idea of simple meridians and parallels cutting through the empty interior. Of course, the interior wasn't empty at all. It was home to indigenous nations with their own complex boundaries. But to the colonial mindset, straight lines were tidy and modern, a way to divide up land no one in power had properly surveyed. The catch is that drawing a straight line on an old map and then carving that line into the real world are two very different things. When survey teams went out to mark these borders on the ground, they had to deal with heat, remoteness, limited equipment, and the occasional miscalculation. Over hundreds of kilometers, even tiny errors add up. The result is that some of these perfect straight borders actually include small kinks, offsets, and doglegs that you only notice if you zoom right in on a high-resolution map. To the naked eye, they look flawless. To a GPS or a satellite image, they look like someone's hand slipped slightly while drawing. In some places, the official border doesn't line up perfectly with fences or tracks people assumed were on the line. In others, those tiny shifts have quietly changed which side of the border a station or water source belongs to. This is one of those areas where the idea of a border and the physical reality of a border drift apart. On a wall map, there's no difference between roughly straight and actually straight, but when lawyers, surveyors, and landowners sit down to argue about it, they are literally fighting over meters of dirt that were decided by the limitations of 19th century technology. It also says something about how we like our maps to look. We've all grown up with the idea that borders are neat, sharp, and precise. The more you zoom in on Australia, the more you realize that underneath the clean lines is a messy story of compromises and corrections. If you've ever felt like your life plan is less straight than the line between two states, just remember that line isn't as straight as it pretends to be either. All right, we've reached the top of the list. Time for the border, that, in my opinion, best captures the idea of Australia's map completely breaking reality. Number 1. The borders inside your everyday life. Up to now, we've talked about rocks in the ocean, rivers that move, and invisible lines over deep water. But the weirdest borders in Australia might be the ones you cross without even thinking about it. The boundaries between states, councils, and electorates that cut right through the way people actually live. Think about suburbs that are split between two different local councils, where one side of the street gets a particular set of services and the other side gets something slightly different. Or towns right on a state line, where the hospital is in one state, the school in another, and the nearest big supermarket is technically governed by a third set of rules. You can wake up, go to work, visit family, and come home again having crossed multiple invisible borders without ever seeing a sign telling you. We notice these borders most when something goes wrong. During lockdowns, some communities found themselves cut in half by state lines that suddenly meant different restrictions on each side of the river or road. People who used to commute freely were stopped at checkpoints, and a line that had existed on paper for over a century suddenly felt very real. Even outside of crises, these invisible borders shape people's lives in subtle ways: which state curriculum your kids study, which politicians you vote for, which laws apply to your job, even which public holidays you get. On a national map, those lines are just colors. On the ground, they quietly decide what normal looks like for you compared to someone living 30 minutes away in another jurisdiction. In a way, that's the real message of this whole list. Borders aren't just the dramatic places with big signs and customs officers. They're also the awkward corners of maps, the legal definitions of riverbanks, the invisible loops around offshore islands, and the unnoticed lines that run through suburbs and farms. Australia's borders look simple from far away, but the closer you get, the stranger the picture becomes. So, now that you've seen 7 examples, I want to throw it back to you. Which of these borders would you show to someone who thinks geography is just memorizing capital cities and coloring in maps? Was it the rock that gave Tasmania a land border, the river that refuses to stay where the law says it should, the invisible neighbors out in the ocean, or the everyday lines that quietly shape people's lives? Drop the number or the name of your favorite in the comments and tell me why. I read a lot of your replies, and your questions and stories often turn into ideas for future videos. If you've got a local border quirk where you live that deserves its own episode, definitely share that too. And if you've made it this far, chances are you like this kind of laid-back, map-obsessed deep dive. So if you want more videos about strange borders, ghost towns, impossible islands, and the way geography bends reality, feel free to stick around, explore the playlists on the channel, and consider subscribing. That way you won't miss the next time a perfectly normal map turns out to be anything but.